March 3rd, 1944. Berlin, deep beneath the Reich Ministry for Armaments and War Production. The stairwell smelled of damp concrete, coal dust, and cold sweat. Oberst Hans Keller gripped the metal railing as he descended, boots ringing on the narrow steps, each echo swallowed by the bunker below. Somewhere above, the city was still smoldering. You could taste last night's raid in the air, fine grit on the tongue, that sour tang of burned plaster and shattered glass that never quite went away anymore. At the bottom of the stairs, a Luftwaffe adjutant in a crumpled blue tunic snapped to attention, more from habit than conviction. "Herr Oberst," he said, voice thin with fatigue. "The Speer reports you requested. They're waiting in conference room 3. Keller nodded. His greatcoat was dusted white at the shoulders where masonry had blown loose along Wilhelmstrasse. On the drive over, he'd watched fire crews, still spraying blackened shells of apartment blocks. Yet, if you listened to the radio, last night had been repelled with heavy losses to the enemy. He stepped into the corridor, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the metallic clack of typewriters. Telephones rang without pause, field gray and navy blue uniforms moving in a jittery, sleepless flow. On one wall, a map of Germany was pinned, beneath a forest of tiny flags and colored pins, red circles around refineries, synthetic fuel plants, marshalling yards. To a casual eye, it looked impressively organized. To Keller, it looked like a patient covered in bandages. Conference room 3 was small, low-ceilinged, lit by 2 buzzing lamps that cast a sickly yellow over everything. There was a rectangular table, a carafe of coffee gone cold, and at the far end, a stack of brown folders thick enough to stop a pistol round. A neat label on the top one read, "Speer, Sonderbericht, Luftangriff, Stand 1, Mers, 1944. Special report air attack status as of March 1st. Keller slipped off his gloves and opened it. The first pages were tables, neat, rigid, utterly unforgiving, columns of locations and tonnage, percentages and arrows that all pointed in the wrong direction. Leuna synthetic fuel plant, output at 42% of pre-raid capacity. Politz, 38%. Meersburg, 51%, further degradation expected. He turned the page. Another column, average time to repair major damage, projected 3-6 months. The figures were circled in blue pencil, Speer's own annotation scrawled in the margin. Optimistic, assumes no repeat raids. Keller's jaw tightened. From the corridor just outside, a radio murmured through a half-open door. A cheerful announcer's voice spoke of unbroken German resolve, of enemy bombers beaten back, of decisive new weapons soon to enter the war. Miracle weapons, Wunderwaffen. Keller stared at the word months on the page, then at the long list of refineries below it, each one with its own ugly percentage. The numbers didn't care about miracle weapons. If you stood behind him, you would see his finger moving slowly down the page, tapping each line as if confirming it was real. Hamburg, Ludwigshafen, Gelsenkirchen, one crippled facility after another. The Allied bombers were not simply burning cities. They were strangling the Reich's bloodstream fuel. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Grim reading, isn't it? The voice came from the corner. Keller started. He hadn't noticed the man in the shadows by the wall. Albert Speer stepped forward, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. He looked tired, but not in the frantic, brittle way so many staff officers did these days. His exhaustion was methodical, organized like someone who had cataloged each hour he hadn't slept. Herr Reichsminister, Keller said, straightening instinctively. I didn't expect. I asked to be informed when those particular tables arrived, Speer interrupted gently. The Führer prefers headlines. I prefer numbers. He pulled out a chair and sat opposite Keller, folding his hands on the table, eyes flicking once to the open folder. You see why we needed a consolidated report, Speer said. Individually, each raid is manageable damage. Together, he gestured at the columns. Together, they are something else entirely. Keller swallowed. He had seen bomb damage, stood by craters wide enough to swallow locomotives, watched trains derailed and tank cars ripped open like tin cans. But this was different. This was the war turned into arithmetic. Another page. Rail yards. Cologne, 60% capacity lost. Nuremberg, throughput reduced by 45%. Frankfurt, critical nodes hit, routing delays averaging 72 hours. Speer leaned back. The schedule from Silesia to the Ruhr, he asked quietly. What does it look like now? Keller thought of the latest transport summaries. Trains rerouted hundreds of kilometers to skirt, destroyed junctions, ammo and coal trapped behind broken bridges, locomotives pulled from the east just to keep anything moving in the west. It looks, Keller said slowly, like a spider's web after someone has pushed a fist through the middle. Speer exhaled, a short, humorless breath that might have been a laugh on a better day. And yet, he said, tilting his head toward the ceiling, the radio will tell us this evening that the enemy's cities are burning, that their factories are in ruins, that our V-weapons are about to change everything. There was no bitterness in his tone, only a weary, clinical precision. Keller flipped to the final summary page. Combined impact of recent air operations. Estimated national fuel production down 40%. Rail capacity in key industrial regions reduced by 30–50%. Time frame for full recovery, not achievable under current conditions. The last line was underlined. Once, that line, Speer said, pointing with one long finger, is the closest thing to treason in this building. If spoken aloud, Keller stared at it. Not achievable. Outside, the bunker vibrated faintly, whether from a distant train or the rumble of more bombers overhead. It was impossible to tell. Somewhere in the building, a telephone slammed down, and a major's voice rose in sudden, helpless anger. Keller looked up from the page and met Speer's eyes. For how long? He asked quietly. Have we been losing this war underground without anyone saying so? Speer held his gaze for a moment, then looked down at the tables again, as if the numbers might rearrange themselves into something kinder. That, he said, is why you are here, Herr Oberst. To decide what to do when the truth on this table no longer matches the truth on the radio. The overhead lights flickered once and steadied. Keller lowered his eyes to the figures again, and for the first time since the war began, felt not fear, not rage, but something colder and far more final. He felt inevitability. The next morning, the numbers got an address. March 4th, 1944. Ruhrgebiet. Approaches to the Leuna synthetic fuel complex. The staff car shuddered as it left the paved road and bounced onto what had once been a smooth concrete perimeter track. Now it was a patchwork of crater lips and hasty repairs, ribbons of gravel dumped into holes that refused to stay filled. Oberst Hans Keller braced one hand against the roof as the car lurched, his other hand folded over the leather folder Speer had pressed on him before departure. The papers inside weren't copies, they were the originals, still smelling faintly of tobacco and the ink from Speer's pen. The driver, a young corporal with soot on his collar, slowed as they approached the shattered outer fence. The wire sagged in places, posts splintered by blast and shrapnel. Beyond it, the refinery rose like a broken skeleton against a low, gray sky, twisted gantries, bent pipes, stacks that no longer drew. A Luftwaffe flak officer waited at the checkpoint, collar tabs dulled by grime. Herr Oberst, he said, saluting. Oberleutnant Vogel, Plant Air Defense Liaison. We weren't told to expect someone from Berlin. Keller climbed out, the air immediately wrapping around him in a damp, chemical chill. It smelled of wet ash and something acrid that clung to the back of the throat. You were told about the last raid, Keller said. He didn't offer a smile. That's enough. Vogel's eyes flickered to the folder under Keller's arm. He hesitated, then gestured toward the heart of the complex. This way, sir. Mind your step." They walked along a rail spur that ended abruptly in a jagged hole. The rails dangled uselessly over empty space. Ties snapped like matchsticks. At the bottom of the crater lay the remains of a tanker car, torn open, its blackened contents pooled and hardened like cooled lava. "Night before last," Vogel said quietly. "Mosquito pathfinders, then heavies. We had cloud cover, thought we were safe." He shrugged. A small, defeated movement. We weren't. As they moved deeper, the rhythm of the damage became clear. A row of distillation towers, 3 intact, 1 gutted, a 4th listing at a sickening angle. Its catwalks twisted down like rungs of a broken ladder. Crushed transformers, buckled pipelines that had once fed the entire complex. Every few meters, chalk marks on concrete, dates, codes, repair priority. Keller stopped beside a knocked-out pumping station. The roof peeled back as if some giant hand had gripped and torn it away. Inside, machinists and forced laborers in striped uniforms worked under the eyes of overseers, hauling new belts, realigning bent shafts, shoveling debris into carts. The ring of hammers and the whine of metal on metal floated up through the jagged opening. "One of 4 main pump houses," Vogel said. "Without it, capacity drops by 20%. Keller finished automatically. Vogel blinked. "Yes, sir. Roughly." Keller opened the folder. The wind tugged at the pages, but he held them firm with gloved fingers. There it was, in Speer's careful columns. Laguna, primary pump house C, destroyed. Projected downtime, 10-12 weeks. Impact on total fuel output, 18-22%. He looked from the line of text to the ripped open building below. Same place, same wound. The numbers had simply gotten here first. "Your guns?" Keller asked without looking up. "How many?" 488 seconds, some 20 millimeters, Vogel said. "We took down at least 8 bombers, maybe more. Hard to confirm in the dark." There was a trace of pride in his voice that evaporated as he added, "They left the fires for the plant to deal with." Keller closed the folder and started walking again. They passed a group of men in blackened overalls rolling a section of pipe along makeshift ramps, their shoulders straining as they pushed. Above them, on a surviving gantry, a line of women with kerchiefs around their hair moved in single file, each carrying coils of cable over one shoulder. Everyone was working. Everyone was already behind. A plant engineer in an oil-stained suit joined them near the central control building, its windows blown out and boarded over with mismatched planks. "Dr. Hellman," he introduced himself, offering a hand Keller didn't take. "We've restored partial flow-through lines 1 and 2, but the cracking units." He broke off at the sound of a distant rumble. All 3 men looked up out of reflex. Not bombers. A freight locomotive, limping along a surviving stretch of track beyond the plant. It moved at a cautious crawl, dragging a short, pitiful string of cars behind it. "How many trains can you handle now?" Keller asked. Hellman gave a short, bitter laugh. "When the rails work," he said, "half, perhaps less. 1 in 5 shipments is late. Sometimes the wagons never arrive. They vanish into the crater belt between here and the Ruhr." "The crater belt," Keller repeated softly. Hellman's eyes were bloodshot, but they were still sharp. "You have the reports," he said, nodding toward Keller's folder. "They tell you tonnage, percentages, delays." He pointed outward, beyond the plant, toward the invisible web of lines and junctions that laced Western Germany. "What they cannot show you is time. We chase time all day, Herr Oberst. The bombers take it away faster than we can borrow it." They walked on. The afternoon wore on in a rhythm of inspection and revelation. A marshalling yard with half its points jammed, rails splayed and twisted, signal boxes reduced to bare chimneys. Warehouses with their roofs punched in, contents scattered, wheat and coal and shell cases mixed in the same blackened piles. At each site, Keller opened the folder. Each time, there was a matching entry, another line of figures that was no longer abstract. By dusk, he stood at the edge of a shattered bridge, staring down at a river choked with fallen girders. "The replacement span?" he asked the army engineer beside him. "Steel is tight," the man replied. "We've been promised material within the month. If it arrives, we can have something passable by the end of June." At Keller's silence, he added, "Assuming they don't hit it again." Keller's breath plumed in the cold air. The sky was the color of lead now, the first stars smothered by industrial haze. Back in Berlin, the maps in the bunker had shown lines for railways, little black marks for bridges. On paper, you could redraw lines, sketch alternate routes. Here, there was only empty space where steel should have been. He thought of Speer's underlined sentence, "Time frame for full recovery, not achievable under current conditions." This was what "not achievable" looked like: men improvising with scrap metal and salvaged bolts, shoving wagons manually across broken yards, rerouting entire divisions because a single viaduct was now lying in the water. The driver cleared his throat behind him. "Herr Oberst," he said, "we should be back on the road if we're to reach Essen before curfew." Keller nodded slowly. As they climbed back into the staff car, as the engine coughed to life and turned them toward the distant, bruised glow of another bombed city, Keller opened the folder one last time and laid it flat on his knees. The numbers no longer felt like an abstraction. They felt like coordinates to an avalanche. Somewhere above the clouds to the west, engines would already be warming for the night's work. The staff car's headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the blackout, sweeping over ruins that had once been shop fronts and tram stops. Keller watched them slide past in flickers bricked-up windows, hastily painted white stripes on curb edges, the occasional hollowed-out house staring back with dark, eyeless sockets. By the time he returned to Berlin, the Speer folder weighed far more than paper should. March 6th, 1944. Berlin, Reich Chancellery area. Late afternoon. Snow flurries drifted past the high, sandbagged windows as Keller was shown into the situation room. The place smelled of map varnish, stale smoke, and too many men sharing the same tense air. A large table dominated the center, covered in maps under glass. Colored pins clustered especially thick across Western Germany. Chalk markings circled cities he had just driven through: Leuna, Essen, Cologne, like fresh bruises on a body already covered in older ones. Generals in field gray and admirals in dark blue leaned over the display, murmuring in low voices. A party official in brown, with a bright armband and brighter eyes, stood slightly apart, arms folded, watching everyone else with the smugness of someone who reported directly to men whose portraits hung on the wall. Albert Speer was there too, sleeves rolled up, a thin film of fatigue over his expression. He nodded once when he saw Keller, the briefest acknowledgement in a room where acknowledging the wrong thing could be dangerous. "Ah, our rail expert," said a voice to Keller's left. General der Infanterie von Harnack, older, mustached, the lines around his eyes carved deep by years of staff work, stepped forward. He offered a hand. This time, Keller took it. "You've seen the Rhine-Ruhr belt," von Harnack said quietly, guiding him toward a side map marked with thick blue lines for railways. "I'd like your eyes on this before the briefing begins." He tapped at several penciled arrows. "Here," he said, "we need to move 2 panzer divisions from Silesia to the west within the month. The Führer wants them ready to meet any Anglo-American landing." The way he said the title held a careful neutrality. On paper, the transfer schedule looks ambitious, but possible. Keller studied the routes. They traced a path across Germany like veins, but he saw at once where the flow choked. "This bridge is gone," he said, pointing, remembering the girders lying in that cold river. "You can reroute here, but that ties up this junction, which is already handling fuel trains for the Ruhr. And this yard," he touched another point, remembering buckled tracks and overwhelmed switch crews. "They are lucky to process half their pre-raid capacity." Von Harnack's jaw clenched as he listened. "How long?" he asked. Realistically, Keller didn't answer immediately. He could feel the party official's gaze from across the room, hot and weightless at the same time. "General," Keller said at last, keeping his voice low. If the bombers do not return, and they will, we could improvise something in 6 weeks. If they come back as they have been, he shook his head once. You are trying to squeeze a river through a straw that is getting narrower every night. Von Harnack exhaled slowly through his nose. That bad? Keller almost laughed. Instead, he opened the Speer folder and slid out one of the scarred pages, the one with the underlined sentence. He tapped the summary. This bad, he said. Before the general could respond, a bell sounded somewhere in the building. A wall clock ticked toward the hour. Officers straightened instinctively, chairs scraped, cigarettes were stubbed out in overflowing ashtrays. Gentlemen, called a voice from the doorway. A colonel from the Führer's headquarters, uniform immaculate, despite the travel dust on his boots. We will begin. They took their positions around the central map. Speer and his men on one side, High Command on the other. The party official slid in beside the colonel, hands clasped behind his back, chin tilted slightly upward as if surveying his domain. The colonel began with the usual litany: enemy raids, anti-aircraft claims, fighter victories. He spoke of stout resistance, of significant enemy losses, of no decisive impact on our war production. Keller watched the pinprick muscles working along Speer's jaw. And now, the colonel said, gesturing with a file, a brief report from the Reich Ministry for Armaments on industrial recovery. Speer stepped forward. For a heartbeat, Keller thought he might simply read the truth straight from the page. Instead, the minister chose his words with surgical precision. Despite heavy enemy activity, Speer said, our emergency measures have allowed many plants to resume partial output within acceptable timeframes. Dispersal and decentralization efforts are progressing. However, he allowed the word to hang. A small, dangerous island in a sea of careful optimism. However, our margin for further losses is shrinking. The party official's head snapped slightly at that. Shrinking? He repeated. The Führer has personally assured the nation that our new rocket weapons will soon shift the war back to the enemy's heartland. Morale depends on such truths being supported by our officials, Herr Speer. Morale, Speer said quietly, also depends on trains arriving where they are supposed to. A few officers looked down at their boots. Von Harnack's eyes flicked to Keller as if to say, now. Permission to speak, Herr Reichsminister? Keller asked. Speer gave the barest nod. Keller stepped forward, the folder suddenly very heavy in his hands. Our surveys of the Ruhr and Central transport corridors, he began, show that current rail capacity in key industrial zones has been reduced by up to half. Bridges are down. Junctions are repeatedly retargeted before repairs can take hold. We reroute, we improvise, we work miracles with what we have, but each miracle costs us somewhere else. The party official sniffed. You are from the General Staff? Luftwaffe Logistics, Oberst, Keller said, responsible for coordination between fuel production, rail allocation, and front-line demands. Then perhaps, the man replied with a thin smile, you should emphasize your successes. Our people hear enough defeatism from enemy broadcasts. Keller felt von Harnack stiffen beside him. In that moment, he knew he was standing on the edge of something: career, safety, perhaps more, but he could still taste refinery smoke in his mouth. He could still see laborers shoving wagons by hand across shattered yards. Success, Herr. Keller paused, deliberately not supplying the man's name. Is trains running on time and fuel arriving where it is needed? Our current successes are measured in which disaster we choose to postpone. A muscle twitched in the party official's cheek. Mind your tone, Oberst, he said softly. Words can have consequences in wartime. Speer spoke before anyone else could. It's not his tone you should worry about, the minister said. It's the timetables. They do not care about consequences. They only care about reality. He turned to the assembled officers. We can build 100 V2 rockets a month and launch them at London, Speer said. It will not lift one fallen bridge, not repair one marshalling yard, not refine 1 liter of aviation fuel. The enemy bombers are not just attacking our cities. They are dismantling the invisible machinery that keeps an army moving. The room was very still. So, von Harnack said carefully, "What is your assessment, Herr Reichsminister? Can we sustain major operations in both East and West under current conditions?" Speer looked down at the open folder, at the underlined sentence, then back up. "We can sustain them," he said, "for a time, by cannibalizing everything else. Civilian transport, non-essential industry, even portions of our eastern logistics. But long-term," his gaze moved slowly across the table, touching each face. "Long-term, we are fighting a war of attrition we cannot win, not in coal, not in oil, not in steel. The enemy is winning underground, on rails and in pipes, before a single shot is fired at the front." The party official drew in breath to object, but the colonel from Führer headquarters raised a hand. "These conclusions," the colonel said sharply, "will be appropriately summarized before being presented upwards. Certain phrasing is not helpful." Keller closed the folder. In that instant, he realized something that made the cold in his bones deepen. The problem was no longer just that the bombers were tearing out the arteries of the Reich. It was that, here in this room, the patient was still being told he was in excellent health. In the days after that briefing, the Speer folder never left Keller's briefcase. It became a kind of private heresy he carried from office to office, meeting to meeting, figures that contradicted the speeches, curves that dipped where the charts on the wall still pretended to rise. By late April, the numbers sent him east. April 27th, 1944. Somewhere west of Tarnów, General Government occupied Poland. The siding was muddy, the kind of sticky, clinging mud that tried to peel the soles off your boots with every step. A raw wind cut across the open rail yard, carrying the sour smell of coal smoke and cold cinders. The sky was a low lid of cloud, the color of dirty wool. Keller pulled his coat tighter and stepped down from the staff coach. Around him, the yard felt strangely quiet for a frontline region. Shunted wagons stood in rows, boxcars, flatbeds, tankers, but there was no clatter of couplings, no whistle blasts, no shouted orders. Just the distant cough of a single locomotive idling somewhere out of sight, like a tired animal that had wandered too far from its herd. A field gray figure approached, long coat flapping, service cap pulled low against the wind. "Herr Oberst?" the man called. "Oberst Keller?" "Yes," Keller answered. "Hauptmann Reiter, transport officer, XXXX8, Panzer Corps." The captain's handshake was firm, but his eyes were rimmed with red. "I was told to show you the situation on the ground." The way he said the phrase made it sound like a bad joke. They walked along the edge of the yard, rail lines crisscrossed underfoot, forming steel patterns in the mud. Crows hopped along a distant embankment, pecking at something Keller chose not to look at too closely. "Your corps is supposed to be moving west," Keller said. "Redeployment to counter any landing in the Balkans. The order is on my desk in Berlin." Reiter snorted softly. "On paper," he said. "On the ground, we are waiting for fuel." They came to a line of flat cars, loaded with vehicles' dark shapes, beneath canvas covers, streaked with grime and road dust. Reiter clambered up onto a buffer, pulled back one of the sheets. Beneath it, a Panzer IV squatted on its transport cradle, gun barrel canted slightly to one side, tracks resting idle above the rails. Chalk marks on the hull, unit designation, loading date. "3rd Company, 1st Battalion," Reiter said. "Loaded 2 weeks ago. Still here." Keller stepped closer. The tank smelled of cold metal and old exhaust, that familiar mix he had once associated with power. Now it just smelled like something that wanted to move and couldn't. "What's missing?" he asked, though he already knew. Reiter looked at him as if checking whether the question was sincere. "Fuel," he said. "Orders without fuel are sermons without bread, Herr Oberst. He led Keller further down the line, past more loaded flat cars, past boxcars stenciled with unit markings and dates. The oldest chalk note Keller saw was nearly a month old. Some of the writing had been worn to a ghost of white powder by wind and sleet. At first, we thought it was just local disruption, Ryder said. Partisans. A derailment here, a bridge there. You improvise, you wait a few days, the trains arrive eventually. That's how it worked in 41, 42. He stopped beside a string of tanker cars. They were empty, hatches open, interior stains marking where fuel had once sloshed. Now, he went on, the tankers don't arrive at all, or they arrive late, half full, because someone along the way needed it more. Someone always needs it more. Keller took in the yard with new eyes. The stillness, the loaded cars that should have been miles away by now. It looked less like a staging area and more like a museum exhibit of stalled movement. We've cut civilian traffic, Ryder said. We run troop trains in darkness to save coal. We double-load wagons. We make the men ride on top of vehicles instead of in coaches to save weight. It still isn't enough. A train whistle sounded at last, thin and far off. Keller turned toward it reflexively, spotting a pluming smear of steam on the horizon, the dark shape of a locomotive laboring toward the yard. There, Ryder said. Every time a train comes in, I feel like a gambler seeing the dealer flip over a card. The locomotive eased into view, paint dulled, number plate streaked with soot. It pulled a short string of cars, 3 boxcars, 2 flats, 1 lone tanker. Guess, Ryder said quietly. Fuel? Ammunition? Replacement engines? Or potatoes? The yard crew moved with weary efficiency, switching the cars onto different tracks. The tanker clanged as it rolled, metal echoing out into the damp air. A few minutes later, an NCO jogged over, ledger in hand, saluted. Hauptmann, he said. Consignment from Krakow. Flour, blankets, some medical supplies, potatoes, no fuel. Rieter's jaw tightened for just a second before he nodded. Very good, Feldwebel. Unload and distribute according to standing orders. The NCO trotted away. Miracle weapons, Ryder said after a moment, nodding toward the distant forest where the front line lay beyond the tree line and fields. They tell the men rockets will change everything. Rockets and new jets. He looked back at the silent tank cars and loaded flatbeds. What they do not tell them is that the rockets drink fuel like thirsty horses, and the jets need runways and spare parts and trains. His gaze flicked to the briefcase in Keller's hand. You have the Speer reports, he said, not as a question. I do. Then you know, Ryder said. You've seen it in numbers. I see it in missing trains. Keller thought of the tables in Berlin, fuel output percentages, rail capacity graphs. A line on a page that said 40% had looked brutal but abstract. Here, it was a panzer division stranded on a muddy siding. Its guns pointed nowhere, its steel teeth unable to bite. How are the men? He asked. Morale? Ryder let out a long breath, watching it fog in front of him. They are soldiers, he said. They grumble, they curse, they improvise. They strip fuel from broken vehicles, siphon from anything that still moves. They believe the next train will bring what the last one did not. Many of them still believe the radio, too. And you? Keller asked. Ryder's mouth twitched into something that was almost a smile and almost a grimace. I believe in mathematics, he said, and in geography. You cannot be strong everywhere when the rails themselves are weak. A flak battery thumped somewhere to the west, dull booms rolling over the flat land like someone slamming doors in a far-off house. Both men looked up, instinctively scanning the clouds for the black specks of enemy aircraft. Reconnaissance, Ryder said after a moment. They come, they look, they go. The heavies follow on some other night. Keller shifted his briefcase under his arm, feeling once more the oppressive weight of the pages inside. In Berlin, the bombers had been pins on a map, circles on a wall. At Leuna, they had been twisted steel, and broken pipelines. Here, they were something more subtle, yet more lethal. They were absences, missing trains, empty tankers, orders that could not be obeyed because the war beneath the war was already being lost. "Thank you, Herr Hauptmann," he said. "For what?" Reiter asked. "For showing me what the Speer reports look like when they put on a field gray coat." Reiter inclined his head. "If you find anyone in Berlin who still listens," he said, "tell them this: we do not need more speeches. We need bridges that stay standing and yards that can breathe. Otherwise, the Anglo-Americans won't have to defeat our panzer divisions. They will simply wait for them not to arrive." The wind gusted again, rattling loose metal somewhere on a distant siding. The idle locomotive let out a tired hiss. Keller turned back toward the staff coach, each step through the mud feeling like a march deeper into a realization he could no longer unsee. The mud in Poland clung to Keller's boots long after he boarded the train back west. By the time he returned to Berlin, the Speer tables no longer felt like projections. They felt like a diagnosis. December 23rd, 1944. Ardennes Forest, near Street Vith. The cold came at you sideways. Snowflakes rode the wind in sharp, stinging bursts, swirling through the pine trunks and across the narrow forest road. A line of vehicles stood nose to tail. Along it, half-tracks, trucks, fuel bozers, and tanks, frozen in place beneath the dark canopy like a steel river turned to ice. Keller stepped down from the Kubelwagen, boots crunching on a mixture of packed snow and spilled fuel. The air smelled of exhaust, wet canvas, and the faint, sour tang of cold gasoline that had soaked into the drifts. Somewhere to the west, artillery rumbled. Distant, dull booms rolled and echoed between the hills. Closer at hand, there was a different soundtrack. The cough and sputter of idling engines, shouted curses, the metallic clank of men working on frozen machinery. A Hauptmann in a worn panzer jacket approached, collar turned up against the wind. His cap bore the pink piping of armored troops, the black band stained with oil. "Oberst Keller?" he called over the noise. "Hauptmann Markert, Corps Transport. I was told you wanted to see our progress." The way he spat the last word left no doubt what he thought of it. Keller nodded once. "How far from the line?" he asked. "Depends which map you believe," Markert said. "On the one from OKW, we're 10 kilometers ahead of schedule. On the ground," he swept a gloved hand down the line of motionless vehicles, "we're not far from where we started." They walked along the roadside, tank crews clustered in small groups, breath fogging in the icy air, stamping their boots and rubbing their hands. Some had chipped small trenches into the snow and were sitting on ammunition crates, helmets pushed back, cigarettes glowing in mittened fingers. They passed a Panther tank with its turrets slewed toward the trees, barrel elevated slightly as if sniffing the air for enemies that never came. A private stood on the hull with a length of rubber hose, lips pursed around it, cheeks hollowed as he sucked at an opening in the fuel line of the vehicle ahead, trying to coax the last drops from its tank. "Careful, Berm. You'll drink half of it," someone shouted from below. "At least I'll be warm," the private wheezed back, coughing. Markert's jaw tightened. "We were promised full fuel dumps staged forward," he said to Keller. "Trucks waiting in captured depots. Lightning advance," they said. "Punch through the American lines. Drive to the Meuse, then Antwerp." "And instead?" Keller asked. "Instead," Markert said, "we are siphoning petrol like thieves in a back alley." They stopped beside a truck whose canvas cover had been pulled back. Inside, half a dozen jerry cans rattled loosely against one another, nowhere near enough for the armored regiment's thirst. "How many liters short?" Keller asked. Markert snorted. "Short of what?" he said. "Our dreams? Our orders?" He shook his head. "We are short of reality, Oberst. On paper, the offensive had priority. Fuel from every corner of the Reich, rationed, hoarded, promised. But trains do not move because they are priority. They move because the tracks are intact and the yards are not burning. Keller pictured the maps back in Berlin, the black lines of railways leading from the synthetic fuel plants and refineries he'd walked through in spring. He could almost see the breaks. Leuna, bombed again and again. Politz, smoking. Bridges west of the Rhine lying twisted in their riverbeds. A shout went up somewhere down the column. Men were pointing skyward. Jabo! Jabo! The cry rippled along the line. Without thinking, men dove for ditches and tree trunks. Even Keller flinched, shoulders hunching as he looked up. A single dark speck moved across the washed-out sky, the distant whine of its engine barely audible. Probably just reconnaissance, Markert muttered, though he stayed under the branches like everyone else. When the clouds lifted 3 days ago, they came like wasps, hit every crossroads, every fuel park, every cluster of vehicles they could find. Some of the petrol that did make it forward went up in one afternoon. The speck banked, disappeared behind a curtain of cloud. Slowly, men emerged from cover, brushing snow off their uniforms, laughing too loudly to hide the edge in it. Miracle weapons, Markert said under his breath, almost to himself. They told us jets would sweep the skies clear for this attack. Rockets would pound their cities, but jets do not fly on speeches. Keller glanced at him. You've seen them? He asked. The jets? Once, Markert said. A pair out of Germany, streaking overhead like silver arrows. Beautiful machines. He paused. Grounded now, mostly. Fuel. They resumed walking. Snow squeaked underfoot. The cold gnawed at fingers and toes, crawling up sleeves and down collars. At the head of the column, in a little clearing hacked out of the trees, a field command post had been set up in a requisitioned farmhouse. The windows were boarded over, light seeping out around the edges. A generator coughed and rattled outside, struggling in the cold. Inside, it was marginally warmer, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of wet wool. Maps were tacked to the walls, weighted down with mugs, pistols, and whatever else was heavy enough to keep their curling edges flat. Red arrows stabbed across the paper toward the Meuse. Small tags marked towns, street, Vith, Bastogne, Houffalize names that had already begun to seep into the nervous jokes of the men outside. General Oberst Heinemann, the corps commander, stood bent over the table, gloved finger tracing the planned advance. He looked up as Keller entered. Here he is, Heinemann said, our man from the world of timetables and tank cars. There was no malice in it, only a weary irony. How do you like our offensive, Oberst? He asked. Is it everything the reports promised? Keller stepped up to the table, eyes moving from the bold strokes of the arrows to the small numbers penciled in beside them, distances, estimated times, fuel allocations per day. When these plans were drawn, Heinemann said, we were assured that fuel had been earmarked, that the refineries would support this operation at all costs, that trains had been scheduled weeks in advance. A decisive blow, they said. All resources concentrated. He tapped one of the arrows. This line, here, these divisions, were supposed to be beyond this point 2 days ago. Keller could almost hear Speer's voice in his memory. Our margin for further losses is shrinking. He could see the underlined sentence in the report, time frame for full recovery, not achievable under current conditions. What happened to the fuel? Heinemann asked, not angrily, but as if asking after a comrade who'd failed to show up for a rendezvous. Keller met his gaze. Some of it was never refined, he said. Plants hit, capacity lost. Some of it never left the refineries, rail yards cut, locomotives destroyed. Some of it left and did not arrive. Bridges down, lines blocked, trains diverted to plug other holes. And some of it arrived and burned under Allied bombs before it could be pumped into your tanks. Silence settled over the room. Outside, the wind rattled loose shutters, and a distant gun boomed again. So the offensive fails, said one of the staff officers from a corner, not because the Americans are stronger, but because our fuel has been fighting its own war and losing. Keller didn't answer. He didn't have to. On the wall, the red arrows seemed, suddenly, less like spears and more like veins leading away from a heart that no longer had enough blood to push through them. He looked down at the map and saw two wars overlaid, one of divisions and brigades, forests and rivers, another of pipes and tracks, refineries and junctions. In one, the Wehrmacht still had teeth. In the other, the Allied bombers had already knocked out too many of the jaw's hinges. He felt the weight of that realization settle, cold and irreversible. He looked down at the map and saw two wars overlaid, one of divisions and brigades, forests and rivers, another of pipes and tracks, refineries and junctions. In one, the Wehrmacht still had teeth. In the other, the Allied bombers had already knocked out too many of the jaw's hinges. He felt the weight of that realization settle, cold and irreversible. The farmhouse door banged open on a gust of snow and noise. An adjutant stumbled in, cheeks flushed from the cold, cap askew. "Herr General Oberst," he blurted, saluting Heinemann. "Radio intercepts confirm American counterattacks near Bastogne are gaining ground. They've brought up fresh armor. We're already seeing signs of withdrawal along parts of the line." Heinemann's gaze stayed on the map for a heartbeat longer, as if he could will the red arrows to stiffen and push forward again. Then he straightened. "Of course they've brought up armor," he said quietly. "Their fuel arrives when it's ordered." There was no anger in it, only a tired recognition. Keller watched as officers crowded closer, hands tracing altered routes, talking of defensive lines, fallback positions, elastic response. The language of advance slipped away almost without anyone noticing. The verbs changed themselves. Outside, the engines of the stalled column continued to cough and sputter, one by one, falling silent to save the last liters in their tanks. By the time Keller left the Ardennes, the Great Offensive was already being discussed in the past tense. January 1945. Night train east of Cologne. The carriage was cold enough that every breath fogged the glass. Keller sat opposite a Wehrmacht major whose bandaged hand cradled a tin mug of ersatz coffee, steam curling around his tired face. Outside, the darkness was broken only in brief flashes, fires far off, a distant town lit by searchlights probing for bombers that were always somewhere overhead now. Every so often, the train slowed, then crawled, then stopped outright. Once, when the halt stretched on, Keller stood and slid the compartment door open. The corridor was full of weary men in mixed uniforms, field gray, Luftwaffe blue, navy black leaning against the walls, smoking, dozing on their packs. A nurse with a Red Cross band on her sleeve brushed past the enamel basin in her hands, rattling with every jolt of the train. He pushed his way to the end of the carriage and opened the connecting door. Cold air knifed in. A Feldwebel stood on the gangway, collar up, eyes narrowed against the wind. Keller stepped out beside him. From here, you could see along the length of the train shadowy shapes of wagons stretching into the dark, the faint glow of the locomotive's firebox far ahead. "What's the delay?" Keller asked. "Same as always, Herr Oberst," the Feldwebel said. "Yard up ahead is blocked. Bomb damage. They're picking their way through with whatever tracks are still usable." The train lurched, then stopped again. Somewhere ahead, an engine whistle gave a long, mournful note. "We wait in the dark," the Feldwebel said. "They say it makes it harder for the Tommies to see us from above." He shrugged one shoulder. "But they see everything, sooner or later." Keller looked out into the night. In the distance, beyond the immediate embankment, he could just make out the jagged silhouette of a ruined bridge, its broken teeth jutting up against a sky lit faintly orange by some far-off fire. He thought of the spear tables folded in his briefcase, numbers marching in precise rows, bridge capacity, tonnage, delays. Out here, each line of digits had a shape, a smell, a temperature. A demolished bridge wasn't just a statistic. It was this freezing halt, this ache in the bones, this rail car packed with exhausted men going nowhere. When the train finally ground into motion again, it did so like an old man, standing up slow, reluctant, every joint complaining. 2 days later, Keller was back in Berlin. The city felt thinner now, like a body that had lost too much weight. Empty plots where houses had been, glassless windows boarded over. Rubble piled neatly along curbs to open lanes for the trucks that never seemed to stop. The stairs down to the armaments ministry bunker were the same ones he had descended nearly a year before. The smell of damp concrete hadn't changed. The faces had. There were more lines, more gray hairs, more of that stretched, brittle look in the eyes of the staff officers and clerks. Speer stood over a new set of maps when Keller entered his office. These were not of Europe, or even Germany as a whole. They were a web of circles and arrows clustered around a handful of critical sites: Leuna, Pulitz, Blechhammer, Brooks, synthetic fuel plants, cracking facilities, hydrogenation works. The centers of each ring were heavily shaded, like wounds that would not scab over. Without preamble, Speer slid a sheet of paper across the desk. "February projection," he said. Keller picked it up. It was a simple table, 3 columns, 4 lines. No commentary, no paragraphs, just numbers. Aviation fuel. Output relative to 1,943 average, 12%. Motor fuel. Output relative to 1,943 average, 18%. Synthetic fuel overall. Output relative to 1,943 average, 14%. Underneath, in smaller handwriting, stockpiles exhausted, future operations dependent on current monthly output alone. Keller stared at the percentages. You could almost hear the hollow echo in them. "This is after?" He didn't finish the sentence. "After the cumulative effect of the 8th Air Force, RAF Bomber Command, and the last raids," Speer said. "They come back to the same targets again and again. The rubble has bomb craters now." He moved to the map and tapped the ring around Leuna. "When they first hit this plant," he said, "we could still talk of recovery in months, then weeks. Now," he spread his hands, "we patch what we can between raids, but the larger system has already failed. Pipelines disconnected, rail spurs gone, repair crews dead or drafted for the front." Keller set the paper down carefully, as if it might crumble. "At the Ardennes," he said, "they told me the offensive had priority, that fuel had been hoarded for it at great cost. It was," Speer said, "we starved the training units, the civilians, the Navy. We cannibalized everything that wasn't nailed down. But the bombers have been hammering at the taps, Oberst. You can't pour from a barrel that's already empty." On a side table, a radio murmured. A clipped announcer's voice spoke of tenacity at the front, of new U-boat successes, of forthcoming victories with the help of advanced weapons. Keller felt the familiar dissonance in his chest, that grinding between what the airwaves insisted and what the ink on the paper refused to deny. "How many people up there?" he asked quietly, nodding toward the ceiling, toward the Chancellery and the other ministries. "Truly understand these numbers?" Speer considered the question. "Some do not wish to," he said. "Some cannot. Some understand and hope that will be enough to change them." A faint, tired smile touched the corner of his mouth. "You and I know better. Numbers are like gravity. You can ignore them, but you cannot opt out." He tapped the sheet again. "This," he said, "is gravity. This is why the Ardennes failed before the first tank rolled, why trains sit idle on sidings from Silesia to the Rhine, why we are stripping the last depots to keep a few divisions mobile while others march on their feet." Keller thought of Reiter in Poland, of Markert in the Ardennes, of that lone tanker car rolling into the yard with nothing useful inside. "It began in the air," he said slowly, "but the war is being decided beneath the ground." Speer nodded once. "The enemy learned," he said, "what we should have remembered from 1918. You do not just attack an army, You attack the rails that feed it, the fuel that moves it, the factories that replace its losses. We built miracles of synthetic chemistry and logistics. He looked at the map where all the rings converged. They built bombers. There it was, stated plainly at last. Keller felt something ease in him at the honesty of it, even as the words themselves were a sentence. You asked me last year, he said, to decide what to do when the truth on your table no longer matched the truth on the radio. He gestured toward the fuel projections. We've arrived at that point, Herr Reichsminister. Speer looked at him for a long moment. We arrived some time ago, he said softly. The difference is that now even the lies are running out of fuel. Outside, faint but unmistakable, sirens began to wail the rising, falling note that every German city knew by heart. Somewhere above, beyond concrete and dust and distance, engines would once again be droning toward their targets. This time, Keller thought, they weren't just aiming at cities. They were finishing a war they had already won below the surface. This time, Keller thought, they weren't just aiming at cities. They were finishing a war they had already won below the surface. March 12, 1945. Somewhere between Magdeburg and Hanover. The train did not slow this time. It simply stopped. No shuddering deceleration, no cautious crawl into a yard. One moment, the wheels clattered over the rails in a steady rhythm. The next, the car lurched as the brakes grabbed, coffee slopping onto the floor, men grabbing for straps and luggage. Keller felt the familiar sway vanish from under him. The silence that followed was the heavy kind, the kind you could feel pressing against your ears. In the corridor outside his compartment, voices rose in muted complaint. Someone slid the window down a few centimeters. Cold air and the smell of wood smoke rushed in. Why are we stopping? A young corporal asked no one in particular. We're already late. Late for what? An older sergeant muttered. The Russians aren't. Keller stood and stepped into the corridor, making his way toward the front of the train. Faces turned toward him with that instinctive mixture of curiosity and expectation reserved for anyone in an officer's coat. He stepped down onto the ballast, boots crunching on frost. The sky was a washed-out white, the kind that made it impossible to tell where clouds ended and smoke began. Ahead, the locomotive sat panting, steam venting in fitful bursts. Beyond it, maybe 200 meters up the line, the track simply ended. Sleepy fields on either side, a stand of leafless trees, and, cutting across the railway embankment at an angle, a jagged scar where earth and stone and steel had once been. The bridge was gone. What remained of it jutted from the opposite bank in twisted, rust-streaked teeth. The gap between them yawned over a shallow ravine choked with rubble, chunks of shattered abutment, sections of rail bent into useless curves, a boxcar lying on its side like a toy kicked aside by a careless child. Near the edge, a group of railway workers in battered uniforms stood in a huddle, hands jammed into pockets, breath fogging. A military engineer with a white-topped field cap argued with them in quiet, desperate tones, his gestures taking in the cratered approaches, the sagging embankment, the absence where a structure should be. Keller walked up, the wind tugging at his coat. Herr Oberst, the engineer said when he saw him. The title, automatic. They hit it last week. We had a temporary span. They hit that too. He pointed at a flattened tangle of girders down in the ravine. We could build another, he went on, if we had steel, if we had time, if we had... He let the sentence collapse, as if the missing words had fallen into the hole along with the bridge. How long? Keller asked. The question came out more gently than it had in the Ruhr, in Silesia, in all the other places where he'd asked it. The engineer gave a short, helpless laugh. Under these conditions, he said, with the yards what they are, with the bombers overhead, with every span from here to the Rhine on someone's target list, he shook his head. I could tell you 6 weeks. I could tell you 6 months. It would all be the same lie. Behind them, the train crew had climbed down. Some of the passengers, braver or more curious than the rest, stood on the ballast, staring past the locomotive at the gap in front of them. One of them, a Feldwebel with a scar down his cheek, took in the broken bridge, the long gray snake of wagons behind them, and snorted. "Well," he said, loud enough for others to hear, "it seems the Führer has ordered the rails to advance without us." A few men laughed, the sound a little too sharp. Keller looked from their faces back to the ravine. In his mind, he laid one of Speer's tables over the scene like tracing paper. Bridge number, span length, tonnage per day. In the reports, it was a single line in a neat column, destroyed, no bypass. A scribble in the margin, priority repair. Here, it was a verdict. Everything behind this point, guns, fuel, men, was now a queue with no destination. He turned to the engineer. "Is there a detour?" he asked. "Another line?" "There was," the man said, "farther south, but they hit that junction 3 times last month. We send what we can by road." He jerked his chin toward a muddy lane parallel to the tracks, where a trickle of trucks crawled along, sagging under loads meant for trains. But roads are fragile. Trucks break. Tires wear. Fuel. He glanced at Keller. "You know about fuel?" Yes, Keller thought. He knew about fuel. "Tell your men to get the passengers back on board," he said quietly. "We'll wait for orders from the rail office." The engineer nodded, moving off with the slow, heavy steps of someone who had already seen too many orders that couldn't be obeyed. As Keller walked back along the line of wagons, he could feel it, the shift inside himself from analysis to conclusion. The Speer reports had been warnings, diagnoses, forecasts. This bridge, this halted train, this frozen column of men all waiting for a path that no longer existed, they were the thing itself. You could argue about lost battles. You could pretend Stalingrad was a necessary sacrifice, Kursk an incomplete success, Normandy a temporary setback. You could dress retreat up almost convincingly if your radio announcers were skilled and your censors thorough. You could not argue with a missing bridge. April 25th, 1945. Berlin, an office stripped for the end. The armaments ministry bunker was quieter now, not because there was less to do, but because everyone knew the point at which doing it might matter had passed. Maps had been taken down, pinned back up elsewhere, then finally rolled and stacked in corners like firewood. Furniture had vanished, room by room, scavenged for barricades or burned in small stoves. Even the electric lights seemed tired, flickering more often, humming louder. Speer's office was half empty. The big desk remained, but much of what had once cluttered it was gone. The radio in the corner still worked, though it was turned down low, as if its voice might attract shells. On the wall, someone had drawn in pencil the outline of Germany. No names, no borders, just the silhouette. 2 lines cut across it in different colors, one pushing from east to west, one from west to east. Both had reached the center and then crossed, like swords driven clean through. Keller stood looking at it when Speer came in. "You see why we stopped using detailed maps," the minister said, closing the door behind him. "At this scale, the front is easier to understand." He crossed to the desk and set down a thin folder. No thick stacks now, no sprawling tables, just a handful of pages. "We don't have much left to count," he said. Keller turned. "Fuel?" he asked. "Not in any meaningful sense," Speer said. "We drain depots as soon as we find them, jug by jug. Every column, every unit is its own scavenger now. The system is gone." He opened the folder and slid out a single sheet, pushing it across the desk. "This is from the Rail Directorate," he said. "They wanted you to see it." Keller picked it up. It was a list not of capacities or projections, but of lines, names of routes he knew by heart, each with a single, blunt word next to it. Ruhr Berlin, unterbrochen. Ruhr Leipzig, unterbrochen. Hamburg Munich, unterbrochen. Upper Silesia, Unterbrochen. Broken, broken, broken. He scanned down the page. Here and there, an exception. Betrieb nur eingeschränkt, operating only in a limited way. But even those were footnoted with warnings, subject to immediate interruption by air attack. Speer watched him read. "When did you know?" the minister asked quietly. Keller looked up. "Know what?" "That it was lost," Speer said. "Not in speeches, not in headlines, in reality, in the language you speak." He nodded at the paper in Keller's hand. "In rails, in fuel." Keller thought back. Not to Stalingrad, though he had understood its gravity. Not to Kursk's wrecked armor fields. Not even to the beaches of Normandy or the Allied advances across France. He saw instead a low bunker in Berlin, March 3rd, 1944. A folder on a table. A neat column of figures and one underlined sentence. Time frame for full recovery. Not achievable under current conditions. "I think," he said slowly, "it was the day I read your first consolidated report. When I saw how much was destroyed, how fast, and how long it would take to repair, even if the bombers never came back." He let the paper fall back to the desk, and I realized the bombers would come back. Outside, somewhere not very far away now, artillery thumped, closer and heavier than before. The walls quivered dust from their seams. "You were early," Speer said. "Many men did not allow themselves to know until the Russians reached the Oder. Some, not until the Americans crossed the Rhine. Some, not even now." He glanced at the pencil outline of Germany on the wall. "The Führer still speaks of iron will," he said, "as if willpower can repair bridges or refine fuel, as if slogans could move trains." Keller followed his gaze. On the map, the two lines that marked the Allied advances had crossed entirely. There was no space left between them that could be called front, just pockets. "What will you tell them?" Keller asked. "When it's over, when they ask how it happened." Speer considered this, then nodded toward the scrap of paper on the desk. "That they built bombers," he said, "and we built targets." He picked up the rail directorate list, folded it once, twice, until it was small enough to fit into his pocket. "History will talk about big battles," he went on. "Stalingrad, Normandy, Kursk, the Ardennes. They make for better stories." He tapped his breast, where the folded paper now rested over his heart. "But this is where we lost. In yards and junctions. In refineries and engine sheds. Underground." Keller said nothing. There was nothing left to add. The sirens began again, that rising, falling wail that had scored Germany's nights for years. Speer reached for the light switch, dimming the bulbs until the room was a cave of shadows and thin, gray daylight. "You should go to the shelter," he said. "No," Keller replied. "I've spent the war watching trains try to outrun what comes from the sky. I think I'll stay here, this time." Speer offered his hand. Keller took it. For a moment, two men stood in a half-empty office in a dying capital, joined by paper, ink, and the quiet, bitter certainty that numbers had told them the truth, long before anyone wanted to hear it. Above them, engines droned. Below them, the rails lay broken. The war on the surface would stagger on for a few more days, a few more streets, a few more ruined buildings. But for Oberst Hans Keller, the war had ended the first time he read Speer's reports and understood what they really meant. The bombers were winning in places no headline mentioned down in the pipes, along the tracks, in the dark between one column of figures and the next. Down in the pipes? Along the tracks? In the dark between one column of figures and the next. 4 months later, the trains were running again. August 2nd, 1945. Somewhere in western Germany, near Kassel. The sky was a hard, clean blue that felt almost indecent after so many gray wartime years. The air smelled of dust and hot iron, and something else Keller had not expected to smell again in his lifetime. Fresh paint on rolling stock? He sat on a rough wooden bench inside a makeshift canteen, once a railway workshop, now a place where men in American uniforms and men in faded field gray lined up at the same counter for tin plates of stew. A single ceiling fan turned lazily overhead, pushing warm air around the room. Outside, beyond the open doors, the yard hummed. Engines moved, not stealthily, not in darkness, not under the constant, hunted awareness that bombers might pick them out of the landscape at any moment. They moved openly, with the careless confidence of something that no longer expected to be struck. Keller could hear them as clearly as he heard the clatter of cutlery and voices around him, the steady chuff of steam locomotives, the creak and clank of couplings, the shouted calls of switchmen in English and German both. He finished the last of his stew and set the plate aside. His hands, thinner now, still bore the faint, ingrained grime of decades around coal dust and machine oil. Some stains did not wash out, no matter how many times you scrubbed. A shadow fell across the table. "Mind if I sit, Colonel?" The voice was American, with that flat, Midwest cadence Keller had heard on radio broadcasts before the war had sealed himself off from such things. He looked up. The man in front of him wore a U.S. Army officer's uniform, khaki shirt, open collar, sleeves rolled neatly, silver oak leaves on his shoulders. His hair was close cropped, his face sun-browned, his eyes watchful, but not hostile. "Of course," Keller said in halting English. "I am no longer an Oberst. Now I am, what is your word, former?" The American smiled faintly and sat. "Lieutenant Colonel Robert Halsey," he said. "Transportation Corps." He nodded toward the yard. "I'm the man in charge of getting this mess untangled." Keller glanced past him at the moving trains. "You seem," he said, "to be doing rather well." Halsey followed his gaze. "It helps," he said, "when you're not getting hit every few nights." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, smoothing it on the table between them. It was a map not unlike those Keller had once pored over in Berlin, but the markings were different. American symbols, American annotations, arrows that denoted reconstruction instead of attack. "We've been told you were the Wehrmacht's liaison to Speer's ministry," Halsey said. "Rails, fuel, allocation. That about right?" Keller hesitated, then nodded. "Then maybe you can help me understand something," Halsey went on. "We knew we were tearing up your rail net. We read the bomb damage reports, saw the aerial reconnaissance photos. Bridges out, yards smoking, refineries burning. But it always felt abstract. We just kept sending the heavies and ticking off targets. I want to know what it looked like from your side. Down in the numbers." Keller studied him. There was no triumph in the man's voice, no gloating, just a professional's curiosity about another professional's work. "You wish to know," Keller said slowly, "when the war was lost." Halsey shrugged. "Something like that." Keller reached for the map. Old reflex. His finger traced the lines almost before he knew he was doing it. "Here," he said, touching the Ruhr. "When you began to hit the marshalling yards in earnest, not just one or two raids, but sustained, when our trains had to detour so far that time itself became a casualty." His finger moved. "Here," he said, "when Liuna and the synthetic fuel plants were attacked again and again, we could patch pipes, we could rebuild a tower, but we could not rebuild an entire system faster than you could destroy it." He tapped a bridge symbol near the Rhine. "And here, and here, and here." Each tap was a memory, now a ravine, a collapsed span, a queue of wagons with nowhere to go. Every gap in the rails was a little piece of the future that could no longer happen. Halsey listened, elbows on the table, hands folded. "We thought in sorties and tonnage," the American said. "How many planes got through? How many bombs on target? They showed us reconnaissance photos before and after." He exhaled through his nose. "Didn't really hit me until I got here and saw yards like this one, torn up. And then I imagined trying to run a war through the wreckage." Keller gave a small, humorless smile. "We did not run the war," he said. "We limped it. carried it on our backs where the rails broke, until there was too little left to carry. Outside, a locomotive's whistle gave a long, confident blast. Through the open doors, a train rolled past a line of loaded flat cars, Sherman tanks squatting on their decks, heading east toward occupation zones. The wheels sang on rails that had been hammered straight and true by men in fresh overalls, under a sky that no longer held death for them. Halsey nodded toward the passing train. "There's something else I'm curious about," he said. "You guys, your high command, you talked about wonder weapons, right up to the end. Jets, rockets, all that. Did you ever believe it?" Keller watched the Shermans go by. The tanks wore the casual coat of dust and grime that came from use, not parade. Each one had a spare fuel can bolted somewhere, hoses coiled, tools strapped down. They looked like what they were, machines that expected to move when ordered. "Miracle weapons," Keller said softly. "We called them that too. It was something to cling to. When you know the ground beneath your feet is giving way, you look up, at rockets, at jets, at anything that isn't the hole opening below you." He gestured toward the yard. "But the hole was here," he said. "In the rails, in the pipes, underground. We knew it, those of us who read Speer's reports. Not all of us could admit it, even to ourselves." Halsey was quiet for a moment. "You know," he said at last, "back home they're already writing books. The big battles, Normandy, the Bulge, the crossing of the Rhine. Those are the stories people understand." "Yes," Keller said. "They have tanks, flags, heroes." He thought of a bridge over a small river, gone. Of a panzer division unmoving in the snow. Of a refinery where men worked under a sky that never stayed blue for long. "Nobody," he said, "will make a painting of a broken marshalling yard." Halsey's mouth quirked. "Maybe not," he said, "but some of us will remember. We had offices full of people just figuring out which bridges to hit next. You had offices full of people trying to work around what we broke. In a way, it was the same war, just fought on paper." Keller nodded once. "The papers," he said, "were always honest. It was our mouths that lied." A final whistle blew. The Sherman train cleared the yard throat, picking up speed as it rolled onto the main line. Its sound faded into the distance, replaced by the everyday noises of a functioning railway, the clank of yard engines, the shout of a foreman calling to a crew, the metallic scrape of coupling chains. Halsey rose. "They'll be coming to talk to you again," he said. "Interrogations, tribunals, all that." He shrugged. "You'll tell them what you want to tell them. I just wanted to hear it from another railman once, without all the politics." Keller looked up at him. "What will you say," he asked, "when you write your own report?" Halsey considered. "That we targeted your fuel and your rails because we could," he said. "And because someone in a room, somewhere, figured out that armies don't move on courage and slogans. They move on trains and gasoline. And when those stop, everything else stops with them." He extended a hand. "Good day, Colonel." Or, "Former Colonel." Keller took it. The grip was firm, brief. When Halsey left, Keller remained at the table for a while, listening to the yard. If you closed your eyes, you could almost pretend it was 1938 again, before uniforms had become costumes for ghosts, trains moving on time, schedules that meant something, rails that led somewhere. But there was no going back. The war had carved its tracks through him just as surely as it had through the countryside. He had seen, too clearly, how the lines on a map could become lines in a ledger, and how, when those lines dipped and broke, so did everything built upon them. Outside, another freight rolled past, this one heavy with sacks and crates, food, tools, supplies for cities learning how to be just cities again, not fortresses. The bombers were gone now. The sirens were silent. But in the quiet, if you listened closely, you could still hear the shape of their victory in the steady, uninterrupted rhythm of wheels on repaired rails, in the unobstructed flow of fuel and freight, not in the roar of battle. In the fact that, for the first time in years, the trains no longer lied.